a man noticed cracks in his garage and decided to repair the road himself. But under the concrete, he stumbled upon a massive steel hatch. Curiosity got the better of him. He opened it and climbed down. What he saw in the darkness made him panic and call 911. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching us from. David Johnson had lived in the same house for almost 20 years, and in all that time, nothing truly unusual had ever disturbed the gentle rhythm of his days. His was a modest one-story American home with a pitched roof, pale siding that had faded under countless summers of sun, and a small front yard that he kept neatly trimmed with more devotion than pride. It was the sort of place where one could disappear into the quiet pulse of suburban life, the kind of neighborhood where the most pressing concern might be whether the mail arrived late or if the neighbor's dog barked too long into the night. David liked it that way. He liked things steady, predictable, ordinary. The man himself was in his mid-50s, his dark skin touched by the years he had spent working outdoors, his hands calloused from decades of labor. He had been raised to believe in hard work, in self-reliance, in fixing what needed to be fixed rather than calling someone else to do it for you. Even now, when his knees ached more than they once had, and the climb up a ladder took him longer, he held on to that principle. He did not waste money on things he could do himself. The quiet rhythm of his life, especially after his children had grown up and moved away, was built on such small acts of control. It was after a stormy night that he first noticed something was wrong. The rain had come down in sheets, hammering against the windows with such persistence that he had spent much of the evening just listening to it beat against the roof, wondering if the gutters would hold. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air damp and heavy, the streets slick and shining in the pale light. The yard was littered with broken branches, and puddles had gathered in the dips of the driveway. He thought little of it at first. Storms came and went every year. But as he pulled his old pickup out of the garage to head to the store, his tires rolled over the concrete, and he felt the uneven rise beneath him, as if the ground itself had shifted. When he parked the truck again later, he crouched down to look. Thin, jagged lines spread across the concrete like veins, running from the edge near the garage door out toward the street. They were not just surface cracks, the kind that appear after years of weathering. They were deeper, sharp fissures that suggested something beneath the surface had given way. He ran his hand along one, feeling the edges crumble under his touch. The thought that the driveway might be collapsing unsettled him, not only because of the cost of repairs, but because of the uncertainty. He liked to know what was happening, to understand the reason behind a problem. That evening, he stood staring at the damage, his jaw set. He could call someone to look at it, sure, but he had the tools in his garage, and it would not hurt to investigate. He convinced himself it was probably nothing more than a broken pipe, or maybe the soil had shifted from all the water. He had repaired worse in his lifetime. So he fetched a shovel, a crowbar, and a pair of thick gloves. He told himself it would be quick work, just a few hours to clear away the broken concrete, see what was underneath, and patch it later. The first strike of the crowbar against the fractured slab echoed in the quiet evening air. The concrete split a little more, fragments scattering across the ground. It was harder than he expected, the years having hardened it into something like stone, but he persisted. Sweat soon rolled down his forehead, and the muscles in his arms burned, yet he kept going, breaking the surface piece by piece. The sound of breaking concrete mixed with the distant hum of insects and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. The deeper he dug, the more the cracks revealed themselves not as random patterns, but as if the slab had been deliberately fractured from below. He frowned, pausing to wipe his brow, staring at the jagged edges. There was something unsettling about the way the ground seemed to resist him, as if reluctant to give up its secret. He pushed the thought aside, telling himself it was nothing. But curiosity gnawed at him, and with every shovelful of dirt he pulled free, he felt an odd pull to see what lay beneath. Hours slipped by unnoticed. His arms ached and the sky deepened into a bruised shade of dusk. Yet David did not stop. When the shovel finally struck something that rang differently, a sharp metallic clang that reverberated up the handle into his bones, he froze. It was not the dull resistance of rock, nor the hollow crunch of roots. It was metal, solid and unmistakable. He dropped to his knees, brushing away clumps of soil with his hands, uncovering a flat surface hidden beneath the earth. His heart quickened as more of it came into view, wide and unbroken, stretching beyond the hole he had dug. The sheen of rust coated it, pitted and scarred by time, but there was no mistaking its unnatural precision. This was no pipe, no random scrap buried in the ground. For a long moment he simply stared, his breathing heavy, his thoughts racing. What was this? Some remnant of an old construction project? An abandoned piece of machinery? The more he revealed, the clearer it became that it was not random at all. It was deliberate, intentional. The edges formed a shape too clean to be natural. David sat back on his heels, sweat cooling on his skin as the air grew chill. The neighborhood around him was quiet now, the houses darkening as families settled in for the night, unaware that beneath the ordinary facade of their streets something ancient, forgotten, perhaps even dangerous lay hidden. He glanced at his garage, at the familiar comfort of his home, and then back to the strange discovery. A ripple of unease moved through him, but alongside it grew a sharper, undeniable curiosity. He had opened the first page of something far larger than himself, and though he did not yet know it, his quiet, ordinary life had already begun to crack as surely as the concrete he had broken. And still, in the gathering dark, his shovel struck again. The following morning, David awoke with his muscles sore from the hours of labor he had poured into his driveway the previous evening. His arms felt heavy, his shoulders tight, and his palms bore faint abrasions from the rough handle of the shovel. Yet, as soon as his eyes opened, his mind returned to the metallic surface he had uncovered. It had not been a dream, nor a product of fatigue. He remembered the clang of metal against steel as vividly as he remembered his own name. It had startled him, filled him with unease. But more than anything, it had left him restless with curiosity. He could not ignore it now. Whatever lay beneath his driveway was not something that belonged there, and he needed to know what it was. After a hurried breakfast, he returned to the site. The morning air was cool, though the rising sun promised another day of heat. His yard smelled of damp soil from the storm that had passed, and the broken fragments of concrete littered the ground like shattered shells. He picked up the shovel again and began clearing away the loose dirt he had piled to one side the night before. Each scrape of the shovel revealed more of the rusted surface below, expanding the strange patch of metal until it was impossible to dismiss as mere debris. The surface stretched outward, wide and solid, with an unmistakable geometry that could only mean one thing. It was some kind of door. As he crouched to examine it, David brushed away layers of dirt with his gloved hands, smearing rust across his palms. The surface was uneven, mottled with deep pits where corrosion had chewed away at the steel. Yet, beneath the years of neglect, it still carried a kind of stubborn strength. He tapped it with the handle of his shovel and heard a hollow, resonant echo. There was empty space beneath. The thought unsettled him. His eyes followed the lines where the soil fell into narrow seams, and there it was, the faint outline of a hinge fused into place by decades of decay. Beside it, almost lost beneath the corrosion, a raised curve suggested the shape of a handle. He leaned closer, squinting, and for the first time noticed something else. Faint markings etched into the surface. They were barely legible, worn down by time, but they were there nonetheless. Letters, maybe numbers, arranged in a way that hinted at meaning. He traced them with his fingertips, though most of the characters had been eaten away by rust. What remained only deepened the mystery, for they were not words that belonged to his driveway, nor to the quiet history of his neighborhood. He sat back on his heels, exhaling slowly. This was not a broken water pipe or some forgotten storage tank. This was deliberate, built with purpose and hidden away. But for what reason? He glanced toward the street, where cars passed now and then, neighbors going about their Saturday routines with no idea of what lay beneath the ground so close to them. Should he tell someone? The thought crossed his mind but quickly retreated. He did not yet understand what he had found, and he was not ready to hand it over. For hours he worked, driven by a stubborn mix of determination and unease. He fetched a wire brush from his garage and scraped at the surface, sending flakes of rust flying. The screech of metal against metal grated in his ears, but it revealed more of the door. Slowly, the outline of the structure became clear. A rectangular hatch, at least 4 feet across, framed by thick steel. It was no casual construction. Whoever had built this had intended it to last. As the morning stretched into afternoon, David's yard grew littered with discarded earth, the edges of the hole widening as he dug deeper to expose the full shape of the hatch. His clothes clung to him with sweat, and dirt streaked his arms and face, but he did not stop. The thought that something hidden for decades, perhaps even longer, lay directly beneath him was enough to silence his fatigue. At one point, when he sat back and stared at the hatch, his breathing heavy, his imagination began to wander, conjuring possibilities he tried to dismiss but could not quite silence. Could it be an old storm shelter, built in fear of tornadoes or war? Or perhaps a forgotten piece of military infrastructure, a relic from the days of Cold War paranoia when bunkers dotted the American landscape? His father had once told him stories about neighbors who built shelters in their backyards, convinced that missiles could fall from the sky at any moment. Some had been filled in, others abandoned, but who could say what had been built under his property long before he bought it? Yet the hatch did not look like something made for a family. Its construction was too heavy, too industrial. It bore the mark of secrecy, of purpose. That thought lingered, gnawing at him. By late afternoon he had cleared enough of the hatch to confirm its nature. The hinges were thick iron bars fused into place. The handle, though stiff and barely recognizable under rust, was still attached. He wrapped his fingers around it and tried to lift, but the door did not budge. He gritted his teeth and pulled harder, but it was as if the earth itself had locked it in place. Frustrated, he dropped the handle and sat back. As the day waned, shadows lengthened across the yard and the air cooled. David remained crouched by the hatch, staring at it as though it were a puzzle daring him to solve it. The unease from the previous night had grown into something more pointed now, a recognition that this was not merely an oddity. This was a secret, sealed and buried, resting beneath his home for God knew how long. The knowledge pressed on him, weighing heavier with every passing hour. He finally rose, his joints stiff, and returned his tools to the garage. But even as he locked the door behind him, his eyes lingered on the patch of exposed steel glinting faintly under the setting sun. He knew he could not leave it at that. Whatever was down there, he would uncover it. He had to. That night, as he lay in bed, sleep refused to come. The image of the rusted hatch floated behind his closed eyes. He thought of the sound the shovel had made when it first struck, the echo that revealed emptiness beneath. He thought of the faint letters, half erased by time, as though they were a message meant for someone who would one day stumble across them. He thought of the air that might linger below, stale and suffocating, locked away from the world above. The house around him was silent, but David's mind churned with restless energy. The ordinary rhythm of his life, the safety of predictable days and quiet evenings, had cracked as surely as the concrete of his driveway. Something had been waiting beneath his feet, and now that he had glimpsed it, he could not pretend it wasn't there. Tomorrow he would return with stronger tools, with oil to loosen the rust, with every ounce of strength he had left. He would open that door. And when he did, whatever lay in the darkness below would no longer remain hidden. By the time the sun rose again, David was already outside, the morning dew still clinging to the grass as he gathered the tools he thought he would need. Sleep had not been kind to him the night before. He had tossed and turned, his thoughts consumed by the image of the rusted hatch buried in his driveway, and each time he closed his eyes he could almost hear the hollow clang echoing back at him, a sound that whispered of secrets long concealed. When dawn finally came, he wasted no time. There was no longer any question in his mind. The hatch had to be opened. The air was crisp with the faint scent of damp soil, and the neighborhood was still quiet, most of his neighbors not yet awake to mow lawns or wash their cars. David felt alone with his secret, as though the world beyond the edges of his property was blind to the discovery he had made. He knelt by the hole he had dug, the steel surface glistening dully where he had scraped away the rust. The markings were clearer in the morning light, though still too faded to decipher. He stared at them for a long moment, a knot of unease twisting in his gut, then set to work. The hatch was solid, its handle fused with corrosion. David sprayed it liberally with oil, watching as the dark liquid seeped into the cracks. He waited, listening to the faint creaks as the metal seemed to absorb the moisture. Then he gripped the handle with both hands and pulled. The metal groaned but did not move. His muscles strained. His breath hissed through clenched teeth. But the hatch resisted, as though determined to remain sealed forever. Frustration surged through him, but he did not give up. He fetched a crowbar from the garage and wedged it into the seam along the edge of the hatch. The crowbar slipped at first, scraping against the rust, but on the second attempt it found purchase. David leaned into it with all his weight, the metal bending beneath the strain. A sound erupted, harsh and jagged, a scream of rusted hinges refusing to yield. For a moment, he thought the bar might snap in his hands, but then, with a violent lurch, the hatch shifted a fraction of an inch. The sudden release startled him, nearly toppling him into the dirt. His heart hammered in his chest as he scrambled back, staring at the small gap that had opened. From within, a breath of air exhaled upward, stale and suffocating, carrying with it the smell of decay, of damp stone and forgotten places. David pulled his shirt over his nose instinctively, but the scent lingered, clawing at his throat. It was the smell of something sealed away for too long, something that belonged to another time. He waited, crouched by the opening, listening. At first, there was nothing, just the ringing in his ears from the effort of prying the hatch open. But then he heard it, faint and unsettling, the soft sound of water dripping somewhere below. The air carried the distant echo of emptiness, magnifying every tiny sound as though the space beneath was vast. David pushed again with the crowbar, widening the opening inch by inch. The hinges screamed in protest, flakes of rust cascading to the ground, until finally the hatch swung open enough to reveal what lay beneath. A dark void yawned back at him, broken only by the glint of a metal staircase descending into blackness. He shone his flashlight into the gap, the beam cutting through the dust and revealing a narrow stairwell, its railings coated in rust, its steps corroded by time. The light vanished into the depths, swallowed by shadow before it could find the floor. A shiver ran through him. He had half expected to find nothing more than a small storage chamber, maybe a forgotten utility room. But this looked deliberate, designed for use. The staircase was too sturdy, too carefully constructed, to have been some afterthought. Whoever had built it had intended it to be used, and then abandoned it, leaving it to rot under the ground. For several long minutes, David remained crouched at the edge, staring down into the void. His flashlight beam quivered slightly in his hand, not from weakness, but from the weight of hesitation. His curiosity urged him forward, but his instincts screamed caution. What if the air down there was poisonous after so many years sealed away? What if the structure had weakened and would collapse under his weight? What if whatever had been hidden down there had been hidden for a reason? Still, the pull of curiosity was stronger than his fear. He lowered the flashlight again, tracing the path of the staircase. The walls were concrete, stained dark by moisture, the occasional glimmer of something metallic embedded within them. The steps themselves looked treacherous, but still intact. His mind churned with possibilities. A bomb shelter, a bunker from the days when America had lived under the shadow of nuclear war, or perhaps something older, built during a time of conflict he could only dimly remember from history books. He stood, pacing back toward the garage to gather more supplies. He returned with a dust mask, a heavier flashlight, and thick gloves. Each addition to his gear made the act feel more official, more inevitable, as though he were preparing for a job that had been waiting for him all along. He paused once more at the hatch, breathing deeply, letting the reality of what he was about to do sink in. Then, gripping the railing of the staircase, he placed one foot on the first rusted step. The metal creaked beneath his weight, a groan that reverberated through the silence of the underground. Dust rose in a faint cloud, making him cough despite the mask. He paused, testing the strength of the step, then shifted his weight fully onto it. It held. Slowly, cautiously, he descended, his flashlight beam dancing along the walls. Each step carried him further from the familiar safety of his driveway, deeper into the unknown. The air grew colder as he went down, and the smell intensified, thick with mildew and the acrid tang of rust. His heart pounded in his chest, echoing in his ears with each careful movement. He tried to count the steps, but the numbers slipped away as the darkness pressed closer. When he finally paused, he turned the light downward and saw the suggestion of a floor below. The staircase seemed to lead into a chamber, but from where he stood, its contents remained shrouded in shadow. A sudden noise broke the silence, a metallic ping, as though something had shifted below. David froze, gripping the railing tightly, his flashlight fixed on the darkness beneath him. His mind conjured images of animals nesting in the forgotten space, or worse, of structural collapse. But no movement followed, only the echo fading into silence. He swallowed hard and continued his descent. When his boots finally touched solid ground, the echo of the impact traveled through the chamber. The space around him was larger than he had imagined, the beam of his flashlight revealing glimpses of concrete walls stretching outward. He swept the light across the floor and saw the outlines of crates stacked against the far wall, their surfaces mottled with rot and rust. Old shelving units sagged under the weight of time, their contents obscured by dust. The chamber was not empty. It had been used, perhaps for years, then abandoned and left to decay. David's breath caught in his throat. He had expected little more than rubble, perhaps discarded equipment. But this was something else entirely. The room was filled with objects that spoke of purpose, of intention. He took a cautious step forward, the sound of his boots crunching against debris, and lifted the beam of his flashlight to one of the crates. Faded stenciling was barely visible on its side, letters that seemed military in nature. His pulse quickened as he realized what he might have uncovered. Suddenly, the weight of it all crashed down upon him, the secrecy, the deliberate construction, the decades of silence. Whatever this place had once been, it was not meant to be found by accident. And yet, here he was, standing in the shadows of a hidden chamber beneath his home, the heavy door above yawning open like a wound in the earth. He turned back toward the staircase, considering retreat, but the lure of answers drew his eyes again to the crates. He could not leave now. He needed to know what was inside them, what had been hidden away for so long beneath the feet of unsuspecting neighbors. The discovery was too great, too dangerous to ignore. David lifted his flashlight higher, inhaled deeply against the stench of decay, and took another step deeper into the chamber, unaware that with every movement he was drawing closer to a revelation that would shatter the quiet simplicity of his life forever. The chamber smelled of dampness and iron, and as David stood at the bottom of the rusted staircase with the beam of his flashlight slicing through the gloom, he realized he had crossed an invisible threshold. The world above, with its trimmed lawns, quiet streets, and the hum of everyday suburban life, seemed impossibly distant now. He had stepped into a place that had been deliberately hidden, sealed away with heavy steel and buried under decades of earth. The silence here was oppressive, not the silence of peace, but of something forgotten, as though the room itself resented his intrusion. His breath fogged faintly in the cool air, and the sound of it echoed unnaturally. Each cautious movement he made sent ripples through the stillness, reminding him that he was alone in this underground place, and that no one above had the faintest idea where he was. He directed his flashlight across the chamber again, tracing the lines of the concrete walls. They were rough but solid, streaked with dark stains from water that had seeped in over the years. Rusted pipes protruded in places, their ends capped or broken, silent veins of a structure long abandoned. David forced himself to move further from the staircase, his boots crunching on fragments of debris. The floor was uneven, littered with dust, chips of concrete, and remnants of things that had once been organized but had since collapsed under neglect. He focused the flashlight on one of the crates he had seen before, its wood swollen and cracked with moisture, nails eaten away by rust. He crouched, brushing his gloved hand along the faded stenciling. The letters were almost gone, blurred into the wood, but he could make out traces of something official, blocky letters that looked military. He shivered, though the chamber was already cold. He pried at the edge of the crate, testing its integrity. The wood splintered easily, brittle from time, and with a sharp crack one corner broke away. Dust erupted, stinging his throat even through the mask he wore. He coughed, swiping at the air with his hand, then peered inside. The beam of his flashlight fell on a collection of objects wrapped in fabric that had long since frayed. He pulled at the corner of one bundle, revealing the dark shape of a rifle, its barrel corroded, its surface pitted with rust. The sight of it made his stomach lurch. This was not a simple storage chamber. This was an arsenal, or what had once been one. He staggered back, his mind racing. The crates against the far wall might hold more of the same, perhaps worse. He swept the flashlight across them, catching glimpses of metal glinting faintly through gaps in the wood, shapes too uniform to be random. He thought of grenades, of ammunition, of things volatile and dangerous that might have survived intact even after decades in the dark. The idea that his house, his neighbors' houses, the entire block, had been built over such a cache of weapons made his pulse quicken and his throat tighten. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him. He turned back toward the staircase, thinking he should leave now, close the hatch, and pretend none of this had happened. But he hesitated, frozen in place. He had come this far. To leave now would be to surrender to fear, to abandon the questions that gnawed at him. Who had built this? Why had it been sealed away? And how had it been forgotten? The flashlight beam quivered as he raised it toward the far end of the chamber. There, beyond the rows of crates, he saw another doorway. It was framed in steel, the door itself half open, hanging at an angle as though its hinges had weakened. Darkness spilled through the gap, thicker and deeper than the gloom of the chamber itself. He swallowed hard, the taste of rust heavy on his tongue, and moved toward it. Each step seemed to stretch time, the crunch of his boots against the floor echoing like thunder in his ears. The closer he came, the colder the air grew, as though the next room had never known warmth. When he reached the threshold, he shone his flashlight inside. The beam revealed a narrow corridor, its walls reinforced with metal plates bolted into concrete. The corridor sloped slightly downward, disappearing into blackness. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, each drop striking the floor with a hollow plink that reverberated endlessly. He stood at the entrance, gripping the frame with one hand, and considered turning back. But once again, curiosity pushed him forward. He stepped into the corridor, the sound of his own movements amplified until it felt as if he were not alone. The air was heavy, pressing against him, forcing each breath to come shallow and cautious. He tried to imagine the men who had walked this same path long before him, perhaps soldiers or engineers, carrying supplies or secrets into the depths. The thought that he was following their footsteps after so many years both thrilled and unsettled him. The corridor stretched longer than he expected, twisting slightly, leading him deeper into the earth. His flashlight beam picked out details along the walls, hooks where equipment might once have hung, faded signs painted directly onto the metal, too corroded to be read. At one point, he passed a collapsed section where part of the ceiling had given way, scattering rubble across the floor. He climbed over it carefully, his boots slipping on the damp surface, his heart thudding with the fear that the structure might not hold. Yet, somehow it did, groaning faintly as though resenting his passage. Finally, the corridor opened into a second chamber, smaller than the first, but more intact. Here, the shelves were still upright, their contents better preserved. His flashlight glimmered on glass jars sealed with wax, on tin containers stacked neatly, their labels illegible but their purpose unmistakably practical. Supplies, he realized, meant to sustain life underground. Whoever had built this had prepared for a long stay, expecting to wait out disaster while the world above burned or crumbled. David's imagination spun. He had heard of such things, of Cold War shelters stocked with food and weapons, built in secret by governments or even paranoid individuals. But this one was too elaborate, too professional to be the work of a single homeowner. The construction, the supplies, the sheer scale of it. This had been official, and it had been abandoned, left to rot while a neighborhood grew above it. As he walked among the shelves, his flashlight caught something on the far wall, a map pinned to a board, its edges curled and brittle. He approached, brushing dust from its surface. It showed the outlines of his town, though the streets were fewer, the layout older. Markings dotted the map, circles and lines drawn in thick pencil, though their meaning was lost to him. Still, the sight of it made his chest tighten. His own street was there, his house nothing more than a blank square above a shaded section marked heavily. This bunker had not been accidental. It had been part of something larger, a network or a plan that had never come to fruition. David lowered the flashlight, staring at the floor as his thoughts swirled. He felt as though he had stepped not just into a hidden place, but into history itself, a fragment of a past no one had told him existed. It was terrifying and exhilarating at once. He realized then that he could not simply walk away. He would have to know more, to see the full extent of this place, but even as the urge to press on burned within him, so too did the fear grow. The crates, the weapons, the stale supplies, all of it was dangerous in ways he could barely grasp. The longer he lingered here, the more he risked. He turned back toward the corridor, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. His mouth was dry, his pulse quickened, and yet his steps carried him back into the darkness. The descent had only just begun, and whatever truths lay hidden in the depths would not reveal themselves without cost. When, at last, he reached the first chamber again, he paused at the base of the staircase and looked up. The hatch above was still open, the faint glow of daylight filtering through the gap, a reminder of the ordinary world waiting above, but it felt impossibly far away now, like a dream from which he had already awakened. He lingered there, torn between the safety of retreat and the peril of discovery, until the weight of his choice settled heavily on his shoulders. He knew he would not be able to turn back. Not now. The secrets of the bunker had already reached for him, and whether he liked it or not, he was bound to uncover them. The cold air pressed around him, whispering with the echoes of forgotten years, and David Johnson, a man who had lived a quiet, ordinary life, realized he was standing on the edge of something that would change him forever. The silence of the underground pressed heavily on David as he stood once more in the chamber with the crates and rusted shelves, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The descent into this forgotten place had already revealed more than he could have imagined, but what unsettled him most was the growing certainty that he had not yet seen the worst of it. He felt like an intruder wandering through the remnants of a hidden era, a man who had stumbled into secrets that had been sealed away with deliberate purpose. The air seemed thicker now, as though the very walls exhaled the weight of all that had been left behind, and every echo of his footsteps reminded him of the fragile boundary between the ordinary life he once knew and the dangerous reality he now faced. He forced himself to step closer to the largest of the crates. The wood groaned under his touch, the splinters brittle and soft from years of dampness. He set the flashlight down on a piece of broken concrete so the beam washed across the container, then gripped the edge with both hands and pried. The nails resisted at first, their heads swollen with rust, but with a sharp crack they yielded. The lid shifted, and a puff of stale dust burst into the air, coating his throat and stinging his eyes. He coughed, tugging the mask tighter, and leaned over the open crate. Inside lay a collection of metal cylinders wrapped in fabric that had darkened with age. For a moment, he did not recognize them, but as he pulled one bundle free and the cloth crumbled in his hand, his stomach lurched. It was a mortar shell, its casing pitted and streaked with rust, but unmistakably dangerous. He dropped it back into the crate with a shudder, the sound echoing far too loudly in the chamber, and stepped back, his pulse hammering in his ears. The realization washed over him with cold clarity. This was not just a shelter stocked with supplies. It was an armory, a cache of weapons left to rot beneath his home. Each crate stacked against the wall could hold similar horrors: grenades, bullets, bombs that time had not entirely diffused. The thought that all of this had been resting beneath the concrete driveway where he parked his truck, beneath the house where he had lived for decades, left him dizzy with disbelief. He had been unknowingly sleeping above a graveyard of steel and fire. He turned the flashlight toward another crate, smaller but sealed tighter. The stenciling on this one was clearer, the letters bold enough that even the years had not erased them. Ordinance. The word alone was enough to make him hesitate, but curiosity overpowered caution. He pried it open, his hands shaking despite himself, and inside he saw rows of grenades nestled in straw that had long since blackened with mold. Their pins were still intact, their bodies rusted but whole. He staggered back, nearly tripping over a piece of debris, his breath coming in ragged bursts. It struck him then how close he had already come to catastrophe. A single careless move, a single slip of his hand, could have been enough to unleash devastation not only on himself, but on every family living nearby. The neighborhood children who rode their bicycles past his house, the elderly couple who tended roses across the street, the mothers who pushed strollers along the sidewalks, none of them had any idea of the danger lying just a few feet beneath their lives. He steadied himself, gripping the flashlight until his knuckles ached. He told himself to leave, to climb the staircase and close the hatch and never come back. But his eyes betrayed him, sweeping once more across the chamber, drawn to the dark shapes of the other containers, to the shadows that seemed to conceal more secrets. He had to know the full truth. He needed to understand what kind of place this was and why it had been left to fester beneath his home. Moving cautiously, he edged deeper into the chamber. His light caught on an object leaning against the wall, a rusted metal cabinet with its door ajar. He hesitated, then pulled it open. Inside, arranged with a precision that time had not entirely erased, were rifles stacked upright, their barrels pointed toward the ceiling. They were coated in grime, their stocks warped, but they remained unmistakable instruments of war. He reached for one, his hand brushing the cold surface, and felt a jolt of revulsion. It was as though he had touched not just metal, but memory, a relic of violence deliberately entombed. He let it go quickly, his fingers trembling, his mind spun with possibilities. Had this bunker been part of a military installation during the war? Had it been intended as a hidden cache in case of invasion, or a secret supply point for soldiers who never came? Or worse, had it been concealed precisely because it was never meant to be discovered? The presence of maps, of supplies, of weapons too numerous to belong to a single household suggested something larger. As he turned, his flashlight beam swept across another object in the far corner, a stack of smaller boxes, their tops covered in layers of dust. He approached them slowly, his heart pounding, and brushed the surface clean. These were metal cases, sturdier than the wooden crates, and each bore a faded stamp. He crouched, angling the flashlight to read. The markings chilled him. They indicated explosives. For a long moment, he did not move, crouched there with the beam fixed on the cases. His throat tightened, his body frozen with the knowledge of what lay before him. Explosives, likely unstable after decades underground, packed and forgotten beneath a suburban neighborhood. He imagined the devastation they could unleash, the sudden eruption of fire and steel tearing apart the quiet world above. The thought forced him to sit back heavily on the cold floor, his mind reeling. He stayed that way for what felt like hours, his thoughts swinging between denial and dread. The bunker was not simply a curiosity, not just a forgotten relic. It was a ticking time bomb, and he was the only one who knew it was there. The responsibility pressed on him with unbearable weight. He wanted to run, to leave it all behind, but deep down he knew he could not. Ignorance was no longer an option. Gathering what resolve he could, he lifted the flashlight again and swept the beam across the chamber one final time. The crates, the rifles, the grenades, the explosives, everywhere his light fell, danger stared back at him. And yet, mingled with the fear was a strange, terrible fascination. He was standing in the middle of history, in a place that had been buried and forgotten, while the world above went on as if it had never existed. The walls whispered of secrets, of men who had carried these weapons into the earth, expecting them to be needed, and then vanished from memory. The silence seemed to throb now, every drip of water from the ceiling a reminder that time had passed, but danger remained. David knew then that he had reached a turning point. To continue was to risk his life and perhaps the lives of others, but to turn away was to leave the threat unresolved, festering beneath his neighbor's feet. He rose slowly, his legs stiff, and looked toward the staircase. The faint shaft of daylight still glowed there, a fragile promise of safety. But between him and that light stood the truth of what he had found, heavy and unforgiving. He took one step toward the stairs, then stopped, his body torn between instinct and duty. His mind replayed the sight of the explosives, the weapons, the potential for disaster. He could not simply close the hatch and pretend it did not exist. He could not unsee what he had uncovered. Whether he liked it or not, the responsibility was his now. As he stood in the gloom, the air cold and suffocating around him, he realized that the choice he made in the coming hours would change everything. His quiet life, his ordinary existence, had already been shattered by the discovery. The question now was not whether he could return to normal, but whether normal had ever truly been possible when such a terrible secret had been slumbering beneath his feet all along. David turned back toward the chamber, the beam of his flashlight catching once more on the word stenciled across the crate: ordinance. The letters seemed to burn into his vision, stark and undeniable. The truth was clear. He was living on borrowed time, and the countdown had already begun. The air inside the bunker felt colder after the sight of the explosives, as though the very space had shifted from being merely strange to something actively hostile. David stood still, his flashlight beam quivering across the stacks of crates, his lungs tight as though the stale air itself resisted him. The knowledge of what he had just uncovered weighed down on his shoulders with almost physical force. It was no longer a matter of curiosity or discovery. It was a matter of survival, not only his own, but that of everyone who lived above this hidden vault of weapons and explosives. Every face he knew in the neighborhood rose in his mind's eye. The children who played in the cul-de-sac, the young couple who had just moved in across the street, the elderly widow who tended her flowers each morning. They were all oblivious to the danger, and that oblivion made his own knowledge unbearable. For several long minutes he simply stood there, the silence broken only by the steady drip of water from the ceiling, his body frozen with indecision. The fear of what might happen if he told someone fought against the dread of what would happen if he did not. He imagined the authorities descending on his home, the yard filled with flashing lights and heavy vehicles, strangers in protective gear swarming over his driveway and into his house. He imagined the neighborhood evacuated, his home condemned, the place where he had built his life stripped from him in an instant. Yet, alongside those fears rose another, darker vision, the sudden roar of an explosion, the neighborhood reduced to rubble, and himself blamed for ignoring what he had found. His knees felt weak, so he lowered himself to sit on a fragment of broken concrete, setting the flashlight down beside him. The beam angled across the floor, catching on the curve of a mortar shell resting in one of the crates, its rusted surface glimmering faintly. The sight made him shudder and look away. He pressed his palms against his face, forcing himself to breathe slowly, but each breath tasted of mold and metal, as if the air itself reminded him of the danger. He thought of his father, who had been a veteran, a man who had lived his life with a quiet sense of duty even when no one else seemed to notice. His father had taught him that responsibility was not something you could set aside when it was inconvenient. It was a weight you carried whether you wanted to or not. David remembered the old stories of sacrifice, of comrades lost in battle, of choices that had to be made for the sake of others. Those stories had seemed distant when he was young, pieces of history that belonged to another world. But now, sitting in the dark with the shadows of weapons pressing in on him, they felt achingly real. Perhaps this was his own moment, the kind of moment his father had spoken of when the burden of choice fell squarely on his shoulders. The thought made his chest ache with both pride and fear. He was not a soldier, not a man trained to face danger or make decisions that carried the lives of others. He was just a homeowner, a man who had lived a quiet life, who had wanted nothing more than to fix a crack in his driveway. And yet, here he was, forced into a decision that could mean the difference between life and death for an entire neighborhood. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh, but the laugh caught in his throat and came out as a ragged breath instead. He rose slowly, his legs stiff, and picked up the flashlight again. He aimed the beam once more across the crates, across the grenades and rifles, the metal cases stamped with warnings. Each object seemed to watch him, to wait for his decision. He whispered to himself without meaning to, a murmur lost in the silence, a vow that he could not simply walk away. The responsibility was his, whether he had chosen it or not. Turning toward the staircase, he began the slow climb upward, each step groaning beneath his weight. The shaft of daylight above seemed impossibly far, but with each movement it grew larger, more tangible, until at last he emerged into the open air. The brightness stung his eyes after the darkness below, and he stood blinking in the yard, sucking in deep breaths of fresh air as though he had been drowning. The ordinary world stretched out before him, the hum of a distant lawnmower, the chatter of birds, the faint sound of a car passing on the street. It was almost surreal to think that beneath this calm scene lay such devastation. He closed the hatch carefully, the rusted hinges groaning as it sealed shut again. He stood over it for a long time, his hand resting on the rough surface, his mind racing. He considered for a fleeting moment whether he might simply cover it up again with concrete, bury it as it had been buried for decades, and return to the quiet rhythm of his life. But even as the thought took shape, he knew it was impossible. The knowledge would not leave him. Every creak of his house, every crack in the pavement, every sudden noise would remind him of what lay beneath. He would never know peace again if he chose ignorance. That night, he sat in his living room, the television on but ignored, the glow of the screen casting shadows across his face. His phone lay on the table before him, silent and accusing. He knew he had to call. He had to tell someone. Police, fire department, anyone who could handle such a discovery, but his hand hesitated each time he reached for the device. Imagine the questions, the suspicion, the possibility that they would see him as reckless for opening the hatch in the first place. He imagined his home marked as unsafe, his belongings abandoned, his life uprooted. The fear of losing everything he had built gnawed at him relentlessly. Yet, as the hours passed, another fear grew stronger. He thought again of the children on bicycles, of the young couple, of the widow with her roses. They were innocent, unknowing, trusting the ground beneath their feet to be solid. If he stayed silent and something happened, their lives would be on his conscience forever. That realization clenched around his heart like a vice, squeezing until the choice became clearer, if not easier. When midnight came, David finally stood, his decision made. He picked up the phone with hands that trembled but no longer faltered. He dialed the number of the local police department, his voice rough as he explained who he was and what he had found. At first, the dispatcher did not seem to understand, but as he repeated himself, describing the weapons, the explosives, the hidden chamber beneath his home, the tone changed. The voice on the other end grew sharper, more urgent, and he was told to stay calm, to leave the hatch sealed, and that officers would be dispatched immediately. As he ended the call, a wave of relief and dread washed over him in equal measure. Relief that the burden was no longer his alone, and dread of what the consequences would be. He sat again, staring at the phone in his hand, the weight of the decision still heavy but no longer unbearable. He had done what he had to do. Outside, the night was quiet, but David could already imagine the chaos that would come with the dawn. Lights, vehicles, strangers in uniforms. His home no longer his own. His life changed forever. Yet, as he leaned back and closed his eyes, he thought of his father's words, of the stories of duty and sacrifice. For the first time, he understood them not as distant echoes, but as living truths. He was afraid, more afraid than he had ever been, but he had done what was right. The hatch lay sealed in the yard, the weapons silent in the earth, but the decision had been made. The fear was still there, sharp and unrelenting, but so too was the knowledge that he had faced it. And in that moment, as the weight of the night pressed in, David Johnson understood that sometimes the measure of a man was not in the life he chose, but in the choices that life forced upon him. The night after David made the call was one of the longest of his life. He dozed in short, uneasy intervals on the couch in his living room, the television flickering soundlessly in the background, his ears straining for every noise outside. When the first faint glow of dawn crept through the blinds, his nerves were already raw, his body tense as though bracing for an impact. He did not have to wait long. The low hum of engines reached him first, growing steadily louder until the sound filled the quiet suburban street. David rose and peered through the window, his heart sinking at the sight of flashing lights. Police cruisers rolled to a stop in front of his house, their red and blue strobes scattering across the walls of his living room. Larger vehicles followed. Trucks painted in muted colors, their sides emblazoned with emblems he did not immediately recognize. Men and women in heavy gear began stepping out, their movements precise, their faces grim. The neighborhood stirred awake in confusion. Curtains twitched open in houses across the street, neighbors emerging in robes and slippers, drawn by the sudden commotion. David stepped outside, the morning air crisp against his skin, and was met with the sharp glare of spotlights and the clipped voices of uniformed officers. One of them approached him quickly, asking his name, confirming his call, then instructing him to step aside. He obeyed, though every step away from his own driveway felt like a surrender of the life he had known. Within minutes, the entire block was transformed. Yellow tape cordoned off his property, and officers moved from door to door, waking families and urging them to evacuate. Some resisted at first, confused or frightened, but the urgency in the voices of the officials left little room for argument. Mothers clutched children close, elderly neighbors were guided down their front steps, and soon the street was filled with clusters of displaced residents staring back at David's house with wide eyes. Their voices buzzed with speculation, their glances darting toward him, some curious, others accusatory, as though he had summoned this chaos into their quiet lives. David stood apart, his arms folded tightly across his chest, trying not to crumble under the weight of their gazes. He could hear fragments of their murmurs, questions about bombs, about danger, about what exactly had been found. No answers came, only the restless hum of fear spreading among them. Meanwhile, the specialists moved quickly. Bomb disposal units, clad in heavy protective suits, descended upon the hatch in David's driveway. They worked with practiced precision, their tools gleaming under the morning light. He watched as they pried it open, far more carefully than he had, and peered inside with cautious movements. Moments later, more personnel arrived carrying equipment, cables, and protective containers. The operation was underway, and though David could not hear their words from where he stood, the tension in their movements spoke volumes. Hours stretched into a blur. The residents of the block were escorted farther away, gathered in a makeshift evacuation zone at a nearby school gymnasium. There, officials offered blankets, coffee, and reassurances that sounded hollow against the weight of uncertainty. David sat on a folding chair at the edge of the room, his hands clasped tightly, his mind unable to rest. Children cried, parents whispered urgently to one another, and yet all eyes seemed to drift back to him from time to time. He was the man who had called, the man who had uncovered whatever danger now held their lives in suspension. By afternoon, a representative from the bomb disposal team entered the gymnasium. The room fell silent as he spoke, explaining in measured tones that the bunker beneath David's property had indeed contained live ordnance, grenades, mortars, and explosives dating back decades, dangerously unstable. The weapons were in the process of being carefully removed and would be transported to a secure location for disposal. Until then, the evacuation would remain in effect. The words sent a ripple of fear through the crowd, yet mingled with it was a strange relief. The threat was real, but at least it was being addressed. David listened, his chest tight with both dread and a strange kind of vindication. He had not been wrong to call. The danger was no longer his private burden, but one shared by the authorities who knew how to handle it. Still, the relief was tempered by the weight of what had been lost. His home, his privacy, perhaps even the trust of his neighbors. None of it would be the same after this. Over the next 2 days, the neighborhood remained a hive of controlled activity. Teams of specialists moved in and out of the bunker, each trip accompanied by the slow, careful removal of crates sealed in protective containers. Trucks came and went under armed escort, ferrying away the remnants of a forgotten war. Journalists appeared at the edges of the barricades, their cameras capturing every angle, their questions shouted toward the officials who offered only rehearsed statements. David found himself approached by reporters as well, though he offered them little. His words felt clumsy when he tried to explain what he had seen, and he recoiled from the eager glint in their eyes as they scribbled notes. To them, he was a story, a headline to be written, a face to place beside the shocking discovery. To him, it was his life unraveling before the world's gaze. By the 3rd day, the evacuation order was lifted. Residents returned cautiously to their homes, casting wary glances at David's house as though it might still conceal secrets. Conversations faltered when he walked past, and though some offered quiet thanks, others could not hide the suspicion in their eyes. He could hardly blame them. It was easier to project fear and frustration onto him than to accept that their neighborhood had always been perched atop a hidden threat. When the last truck finally departed, the hatch in his driveway was left open to the sky, the ground around it torn and scarred from the excavation. The bunker below was empty now, its secrets removed, its danger neutralized. Officials promised it would be sealed permanently, the earth filled, the surface rebuilt. Yet to David, it would never be truly gone. He knew too well what had once lain beneath. On the evening after the last of the crews departed, he stood at the edge of the pit, the cool air brushing against his face as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson. His house loomed behind him, familiar yet forever changed, a place he would never again see as simply his own. He thought of the life he had led before, the quiet days of routine, the safety of ignorance. That life was gone. In its place was the knowledge that beneath the ordinary surface of the world, darkness often slept, waiting for someone to stumble upon it. David closed his eyes, hearing again the echo of the first strike of his shovel against metal, the sound that had begun it all. He wondered if he would ever sleep as peacefully again, if he could ever pass through his driveway without remembering the arsenal buried beneath. Yet, mingled with the unease was something else, something steadier. He had done what was right. The fear had nearly broken him, but he had chosen responsibility over silence, duty over denial. When he finally turned back toward his house, the street around him was quiet again. The neighbors had retreated to their routines, the flashing lights and heavy trucks gone. Life, in its strange way, had begun to settle back into normal. But David knew better. He knew that normal was fragile, that beneath any surface could lie secrets waiting to be uncovered. He carried that truth with him now, a burden and a lesson, etched into his bones as surely as the cracks that had first appeared in his driveway. As night descended, he stood for a moment longer on the scarred earth, his gaze fixed on the dark mouth of the hatch. Then he turned and walked inside, closing the door behind him. His world had changed forever, and though fear still lingered, so too did the quiet strength of a man who had faced it and endured. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next shocking stories. Check out the other videos on this channel for even more unbelievable discoveries, and share this video with your friends, because they won't believe what's hidden right under our feet.